What comes into your mind when you think about drylands? An image of a dusty, windswept landscape? A place where it is hard to survive, let alone thrive? This podcast series may just change your mind. Welcome to Dynamic Drylands, the podcast from SPARC. SPARC is a research program which looks into the future of the drylands of Africa and the Middle East. The podcast is hosted by Bola Mosuro.
Hello, I'm Bola Mosuro, a journalist of over 30 years. And in this time working for the BBC World Service, I reported on global news and current affairs. But Africa is where my heart has been. I've travelled north, south, east and west of the continent, covering everything from elections to tech developments, to droughts and countries rebuilding after war, and to personal stories of trials, tribulations or triumphs. In this series, I'll speak with pastoralists, researchers, innovators and aid workers to find out more about the fast-changing pace of life in these drylands, which stretch across Africa and into the Middle East. And I'm asking, what needs to change to help herders and farmers better navigate the challenges they face in the long term?
This is episode 1. Do we need to rethink aid in the drylands? Arid zones, in my view, are not dead zones. They are areas full of life, full of challenges that are constantly changing. That's why the responses must also be dynamic. Reactions, investments, everything related to these drylands must evolve like the ecosystem itself.
That's Colette Benuji, a researcher I spoke with and just one of a range of guests who shared their experience and expertise. Over the course of this 4-episode mini-series, you'll be hearing more about how people in the drylands are coping with and adapting to new and different challenges. People living in these drylands are no strangers to dealing with uncertainty. For centuries, they've had to deal with the variabilities of nature that come with these areas. If you like, you could say being adaptable and resilient is part of their DNA. After all, these are places where rainfall is erratic and where suitable land for, say, growing crops or feeding cattle can change from year to year. But in an increasingly interconnected world, today's farmers and herders are having to deal with a number of new shocks and stresses, from changing weather patterns to increasing competition over land use, changes in markets and long-term conflict or instability. All of this is making it harder for people to cope and adapt with individual shocks. People working in development like to talk about building resilience to these challenges. But what does this actually mean? For this episode, I've been talking with people about what kind of support farmers and herders need, and what aid programs work and don't work in the drylands. And I'll be digging deeper into how people can adapt and thrive in the face of complex, seemingly unsolvable problems, where decades of marginalisation, insecurity or conflict are compounding new issues such as climate change or the rise of militant insurgency like Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram. But this isn't just a podcast about the drylands. It's about doing aid better and exploring what people outside the drylands, including governments, donors, development practitioners and businesses, can be doing to support the people who live there. Let me introduce you to someone who experienced the famous adaptability and resilience of the people of the drylands firsthand. Dr. Doris Agol is a consultant from Kenya, whose work straddles issues related to the environment, development and humanitarian aid in the drylands. She's currently a research fellow at the London School of Economics, and she told me about an experience that tested her resilience.
I've never come across any communities that are resilient in my life. than the dryland communities. I remember the first time I went to Turkana, I was met by this heat wave. And it was super dry, it was dusty, and I thought for 1 minute, how can someone live here? And I remember going out in the field with young people, young Turkana, young women and men, and working whole day. They didn't drink any water, they didn't have any food, and I was there really thirsty and hungry. So they've always been resilient. It's just the reframing comes when now we're thinking that they cannot bounce back to their normal lives.
Doris Agol. So why are people in the drylands finding it harder to bounce back? Muzamil Abdi Sheikh is a Somali researcher who describes himself as passionate about resilience and peace and security in the Horn of Africa. Somalia has been racked by political violence over the last 10 years, including conflict between clans, infighting within the central government, and a continuing insurgency by al-Shabaab. Against this backdrop, Somalia's situation has been compounded by several natural crises. It's not surprising that these shocks and crises are stretching people's ability to cope, as Muzamil explains.
Somalia has faced a growing challenge over the years, ranging from drought, floods, conflict, desert locusts, and so on and so forth. And if I may talk about, for example, the drought, which has really had a huge toll on them. Let's say between late 2020 up until May this year, the country has endured an unprecedented 5th consecutive failed rains, which actually exacerbated the already existing challenges. And the recurrent drought in Somalia, particularly in 2011, 2016, 2017, and 2022, have presented a troubling pattern of increasing in severity as well as even geographical scope. However, in 2017, 2018, the drought effects became more widespread, and by 2022, the entire country was affected. The severity and magnitude, as well as even the intensity of this drought, have been on the rise. It has caused displacement where communities of different livelihoods, mainly the pastoralist and the agro-pastoral communities, were displaced, and the number has really escalated. In 2011, there were less than 1 million internally displaced persons in Somalia, but now the estimate suggests that there are more than 3.5 million and almost hitting 4 million. And consequently, every other year, about 1 million people, we can say, are flocking, to urban centers, placing immense strain on these areas. And therefore, they are exposed to various risks.
But these environmental shocks aren't happening in a political vacuum, as Muzamil makes clear.
Oftentimes, we don't mention or talk about the conflict that the country has been experiencing and the political disarray that is affecting some of the interventions or perhaps exacerbating the problems that these people are really going through. As we've talked about earlier, there are these clan tensions or conflicts that has existed for so long and is now resurfacing because the government is liberating a number of areas from al-Shabaab. And we do realize that some of the past conflicts that al-Shabaab has suppressed is now resurfacing and coming out, and the government really needs to address that because there are a number of areas, especially Middle Shabelle and also Hiran, where interclan conflict is actually becoming more rampant. The other thing is this political disarray, again, within the government, especially between the federal member states and the central government, is also another layer that actually adds into this. For example, in areas where the government is fighting with al-Shabaab, in its counterinsurgency, you do realize that a number of people are actually migrating and getting displaced as a result of that conflict. Some of them have actually died. Some of them actually lost their animals because al-Shabaab is using these pastoral communities, to fight. Because given that the pastoral communities are mostly in the periphery and al-Shabaab is in the villages, their main, and of course, al-Shabaab or fighting or war, I would say, labor intensive. So they do depend on the pastoral communities to recruiting their youth, sometimes forcefully taking their youth into al-Shabaab And they do force them to donate some of their animals, to give out some of the animals to Al-Shabaab. So these are some of the things actually the pastoral communities are really grappling with. And there is again that political vacuum that I've just talked about.
Muzamil Abdi Sheikh. Now, while his example is specific to Somalia, it's a situation that exists in a number of countries across Africa and the Middle East, and the outcomes are familiar. Buffeted between a fragile political structure, instability and environmental shocks, it's harder and harder for people to bounce back from each new crisis. And these challenges don't affect everyone equally. Let's go back to Colette Benuji, who we heard in the introduction. Colette is a Chadian researcher and expert on lives and livelihood in the drylands. A founder of the NGO Lead Chad, she sees particular vulnerability among women and girls.
On a déjà dit que le contexte dans la zone aride est un contexte marqué.
The context in drylands is marked by many challenges and scarcity in terms of resources and also educational or professional opportunities, but also by a wealth of local knowledge acquired in the networks of neighbors and families. At the same time, communities living in these areas are also victims of all imaginable inequalities. It is these women who collect water, energy, and food, who are simultaneously caring for children and the elderly. As for the youth, they also face many challenges in accessing education, and the lack of education leads to various vulnerabilities, such as unemployment. In our cultures, it is the youth and women who are the most exposed to cultural restrictions and norms that make up a significant barrier to their development. To address these challenges, we need to respond to the specific needs of both women and youth, who make up the majority of the population in the drylands in all countries. Any policy that does not address these disparities, in my opinion, is an exclusive policy that would not truly achieve its objectives.
C'est une politique exclusive et qui n'atteindrait vraiment pas les objectifs.
Colette Benuji there. Now, we've heard how complex long-term crises like those in Somalia and existing inequalities can make it harder for the development community to know how or when to intervene. Simon Levine is a research associate at global affairs think tank ODI, which does a lot of research into understanding what effective development support looks like. He isn't convinced that development practitioners and aid agencies even use the right language to address these issues. This is really apparent when we're talking about resilience.
Because the word is so important, it seduces us into thinking that we know what we're doing. And one of the biggest problems of the aid sector is probably that we rush in with a solution without actually understanding what the problem is, because the problems are always more complicated. And another problem with the word resilience, I think, is it distracts attention from just how difficult it is. It makes it kind of sound, oh, I'm building resilience, I can go out there and build it. But all aid is difficult. I mean, in countries like the UK, for example, with all of the resources, and I don't just mean the financial resources that we have in an economy like ours, but all the knowledge resources, institutions that work, the data that we've got, the thousands of civil servants who can work on topics. Even then, we've still got poverty, we've still got child poverty, we've still got hospitals falling to, let's not go on. We know these problems. Now, if you're trying to solve those problems in a country which really doesn't have enough resources, the government might not have very much legitimacy because people are fighting against it. It's not that the country can't produce qualified doctors, but the moment it produces a qualified doctor, they go off and work in the UK or the US. So you constantly don't have enough, good staff in any direction at all. And now you try and kind of get people out of poverty. That job is so hard. And now add on the resilience angle, because if you're trying to build resilience, as we say, that tends to mean that you're working in the hardest possible places.
It's almost like you're saying that then the word resilience is an ideal, or is in a way an unrealistic term to be using?
We try and, yes, it is an ideal. I think we have to face the fact that we're not going to make people resilient in the places where we are trying to work, which is the most difficult places. And we're trying to work with the people who are most at risk of not having enough food, not being able to send their children to school, and so on and so forth. And the most marginalized places, the places where people have the least voice, so the politics don't usually work in their favor. And then we say we're going to make them resilient. And That's a huge problem in aid generally, is that we say, right, we're going to fix the problem. So we come in with a solution, and that solution is always a solution from here. So I will say, for example, you're more resilient if you're better at anticipating what's coming. Sounds logical? It's true. It's good. Yeah. So then I kind of go, well, are you now better at anticipating what's coming? Yes, you are, because, I've done something, I've put you in touch with a weather forecast, whatever it is. And then I go, oh, so you're more resilient. Hold it, where's the reality check? Has that helped? So, for example, if I get news that a drought is coming and I've got access to a more drought-resistant seed and I know how to use it and it suits my soils and, and there's a market for selling it and so on and so on and so forth, that's fantastic. Now, instead of planting maize, for example, I might plant sorghum or cassava. And I'm more resilient to that bad rain that's coming. But all of those assumptions that I can actually use the information can go out the window because, oh, you're more resilient. I know what resilient means. It means these very, very abstract things. So the twin dangers are this idealism and this abstraction.
Listening to Simon talk about resilience got me thinking about the role of conflict. It's often the common thread running through protracted crises. I asked Simon how aid is given in the midst of conflict.
My contribution to that is it is difficult, and it's difficult for it's difficult for reasons looking in both directions. The problem is so much harder when there's a conflict. Okay, go back to Somalia. We've talked about it before, but let's go back to Somalia. Let's look at 2011 and why people died. You know what? Let's go back further. Let's go back to 1984. Ethiopia. That's the famous famine of all, isn't it? That's the big one. And that was caused by drought. Everyone knows it was caused by drought and the harvest failed. But if I were to ask you, well, national food production was down by how much in Ethiopia that year? The answer is actually around 30%. And in the same year, I have been told, but I haven't actually found this, a written source for this, but I have been told this by someone who should know, that in the same year, there was a drought in Zambia and agricultural production was down by 50%. And nobody's ever heard of the Great Famine in Zambia in 1984 because there wasn't one, because that wasn't the problem. Yes, of course, that's what pushed people over the edge, but it was actually years and years and years of war. Cut to 2011 in Somalia, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people dying. Who died? Well, we know who they died. It was particular ethnic groups died in certain areas, and it wasn't because of poverty, if you like. It was their political marginalization. They didn't have the connections to get aid, to get resources, to get jobs. Why did people struggle? Because the price of food went up by so much. And it didn't go up price of food didn't go up because of the drought. I saw a fantastic map of the country of food prices during the crisis. And you saw kind of in one area, the price was like 5 times higher than in the neighboring area. This isn't because it was further on the transport. This is because there was a conflict going on. And in order to get from one place to another place, you had to go through, the merchants, they can get through checkpoints, but it's risky, it's dangerous. They've got to pay bribes and so on. So the real problem wasn't about the drought. The drought's what pushes people over the edge. So the problem is so much harder when there is a conflict. But the other thing is that the solution becomes harder as well, because it's not just that I'm trying to solve a greater degree of poverty or food insecurity or whatever you want to call it. It's that a lot of my solutions aren't going to work because, if I am throwing resources into a conflict, those resources are going to be fought over. And very often the war economy and the aid economy overlap because we feed war economies, because we're throwing resources in, and the people who are best at capturing them, funnily enough, are not the poor and the marginalized and the people who need it best. But, this might surprise you to know the people best at capturing resources are the people who are powerful. They've got the guns, they've got the political power, they've got they already have more resources. So both your problems are more difficult and your solutions are more difficult. And that does mean that whatever works in a country with a lot of, with really bad, if you like, normal chronic poverty, it's highly unlikely to be transplantable into a place where there is a conflict. So what can you do? Well, slowly.
Simon Levine. So what can be done to support people living in the midst of such complex crises? Dorisa Gol is one of the voices you heard at the start of this episode. This international development expert has been exploring aid and resilience in Turkana. Now, this is an arid area where sadly people are no strangers to drought or flash flooding. And it's a place I visited in the early 1990s. Back then, I always found myself asking the same question of ministers, aid workers, or development activists. Weren't these crises anticipated? And what early warning systems or preemptive measures were taken? Doris has worked among the people of Turkana, and she believes misguided altruism over ambition and not assessing the efficacy of policies may be part of the problem.
I think resilient building landscape is full of ideals, I have to say. We want to pursue this perfect vision, but I think it's important to recognize that we cannot do everything. This, I mean, you want to do so much. I remember about 3-4 years ago, I was evaluating a resilient building project in West Pokot, where a 3-year project, which has so many components and so many packages. They were doing water, sanitation, and hygiene. They were doing beekeeping. They were doing small farming. They were doing everything. And so the first year, you can imagine, is contractual agreements, it's mobilizing the community. And then the second year, they start, implementing the project. And within the third year, a lot of the interventions or the activities have not been implemented.
And if I can ask you why, what was the drawback? Is it that the money ran out, or is it that
limited resources, and they underestimate the fact that it takes time before you actually mobilize the community. So it takes time before things really get going. So the other thing that we focus on is quantifying what we do. So we are saying we have spent $1 million or £1 million, or we have done this and these activities. We want to change the lives of 3,000 households. So I think we need to move away from quantifying and perhaps just say we want to do a few things and we want to do them really well. So that's one pitfall of ambitious. The other important pitfall within the landscape of resilient building interventions and aid is that we try to ignore trade-offs, and that is important. And I mean that we don't think of, if we implement this project, who are going to be the losers and who are going to be the beneficiaries. We don't think of that. We always just think as a win-win situation. For example, in the water project, that one of the interventions, again, under the SPARC program that I was investigating, we found that the NGO had improved a borehole to groundwater extraction. So they did it really well. They put solar power and they dug it really, really deeper in an area which is not too far from the border of Kenya and Uganda. And this is also a migratory route where pastoralists pass through Kenya to going to Uganda and then coming back. But then this one borehole was serving hundreds of communities. It meant that the other boreholes on the next villages, they were not productive anymore because this borehole was very deep and everybody was coming to draw water from this borehole. So what is the problem here? The problem is the trade-off here is that the other boreholes in the surrounding villages are not, there's no water. The other trade-off is that because a lot of people are coming in this area, including the pastoralists, there's now conflicts over land, the space and everything. So the trade-off is so important here. So when you do something, you need to think, who are the losers? The other thing that needs to be done as I talk to the people in the community, I think there's still a lot of top-down approach where we always think, these poor people, we need to build their resilience, but we don't listen to them as such. We always think that we want to build their capacities because we think they are less knowledgeable. But a lot of times we really ignore the indigenous traditional knowledges. So if I give you an example, one of the most important thing, it's kind of anticipatory action plans where you're predicting and you want to take action before something happens. The community, there's still strong cultural practices. The traditional medicine men and women they always have the last word. They can predict the weather, the storms. So an old women and men can say, I think it's going to be drought, there's going to be rain, there's going to be storm, just by looking at the behavior of their livestock or bees. And I have seen an old Turkana man split open the stomach of a goat and reading the intestines of the goat to predict the weather, for example. It's quite amazing. And so what I'm saying here is that they also want to be heard. So if you come up with an action plan where you're saying, okay, we are doing an early warning system, you're doing it through the radio, through someone else, or through the internet, it won't work because people don't listen, people don't pay attention.
And when you talked about the splitting open the stomach of the goat, is that because the old man was looking at the insides, looking at what had been consumed by the goat and could tell what he'd been eating at what particular times? Because some people might be a bit confused.
Yeah, the water and also the size of the intestines. There's quite a lot of things that I remember. It was just amazing. The size of the intestine, the color. There's so many variables. Yeah, this very clinical as well. I was so impressed. And not surprisingly, one of the government officers said, yes, they do that and we appreciate that. But that's in theory as well. It doesn't really, get, into practice. So they're not really much consulted as well.
Dorisa Gol, and it's mind-blowing to hear how this old man could decipher all that from the innards of a goat. Sadly, though, Doris said local knowledge and customs aren't always necessarily taken seriously or used. It's a reminder that new outside solutions need to be integrated with existing ways that people have of responding to uncertainty. Now, before I bring this episode to a close, I'd like to leave you with this final point from Muzamil. I asked him to tell me what he feels people in the drylands really need to build resilience.
One crucial lesson is the importance of prioritizing the basics, because these communities have gone through a number of shocks, drought, floods, conflict, desert locust, and so on and so forth. What they need is the basic needs, the food. We need to make sure that there is the fundamental services such as healthcare, education, clean water, along with establishing social protection mechanism is a key thing that these communities need to be given, so that some of their basic needs are met, and that will actually form, I think, the foundation of building resilience. Once these basic needs are covered, the next step should be to work on rebuilding livelihoods. These may involve activities like restocking for animal husbandry, expanding into commercial food productions, as well as agriculture. And Somalia was among the top 3 banana producers during the good old days. And resilience building could position the country as a good, global exporter of such kind of products. Additionally, I would say we need to address the issues of resource distribution. I know most vulnerable resources in Somalia are controlled by political elites. This now limits the benefits of reaching the poor. Resilience building should aim to redirect resources into the hands of those who need them most, not just the political elite. The other thing I would say is there is need for a holistic approach to resilience building at scale, with the active involvement of the government being very, very important. The other thing is NGOs. I know NGOs sometimes tend to shy away from peace building because it's not their jurisdiction, it's not their area of work. Their focus could be maybe only humanitarian or developmental, but the nexus, humanitarian development and peace nexus should be on the ground and rolling. There are also those peace building organizations that focus only on reconciliation efforts, leading to some sort of disconnect in providing the essential support required for sustainable peace. So I would say it is very, very important to encourage the government to adopt also multiple programming, starting with ensuring basic services universally accessible, and seeing it as their primary duty to regain legitimacy and govern cities effectively.
Muzamil Abdi Sheikh. And his checklist for building resilience isn't exclusive to Somalia. It pertains to many communities across the drylands in Africa and the Middle East. Let's not forget, though, that resilience is not a new concept. Farmers and herders in these semi-arid regions have been adapting to harsh climates and surprise weather events for thousands of years through a wealth of innovative and constantly shifting techniques. But today, they're also facing increasingly frequent, severe and unpredictable shocks and stresses, which are making it harder for them to bounce back. As you've heard today, there's no one silver bullet solution to these complex problems. Concepts like resilience building, a buzz term in the aid and development sector, aren't always clear-cut. After all, what it means to be resilient in the face of a changing climate is different to what it means to be a resilient market in the face of external forces. Rather than searching for that one-size-fits-all solution, perhaps governments and development agencies should focus on understanding what it is that farmers and herders themselves think they need, and working with them to expand their options, to not only deal with today's shocks, but also to prepare for a changing future. Ultimately, any support to people living in the drylands needs to be tailored and unique, as fast-changing and dynamic as the region itself. I'm Bola Mosuro. Thanks for listening to this first episode of Dynamic Drylands. And thank you to today's guests, Doris Agol, Muzamil Abdi Sheikh, Colette Benuji, and Simon Levine. In the next episode, I'll be hearing more about how land and natural resources are shared in the drylands.
Pastoralists need to be allowed to have ownership, or at the very least, secure rights over their lands. As such, they are then the decision makers of their lands within given policy and legislation, of course. But there's this ongoing situation where others are making decisions over pastoralist lands without the landowners or users being included. And really, this has to change if conflicts between land users are to stop.
I'll also be talking to people who are at the forefront of dealing with farmer-herder clashes in the drylands, and what some of the solutions are to resolving increasingly politicized conflicts.
Dynamic Drylands is produced by Loftus Media for SPARC, which is supporting pastoralism and agriculture in recurrent and protracted crises. SPARC aims to inform more effective policies and investments in the drylands of Africa and the Middle East. It is commissioned by the UK's Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office and is managed by Cowater International in partnership with Mercy Corps, ODI, and the International Livestock Research Institute. Thank you to everyone who contributed to this series. For more information about the issues discussed in this podcast, visit the links in the show notes.